Hey guys, it's Timus here, back with another video. Today, I'm going to be teaching you how to get motion blur in your videos. Motion blur essentially blends frames during movement, which results in really smooth videos. I've personally been doing this, and it's made many of my videos look much smoother than before. This tutorial also uses multiple methods, with many of them being low-end PC compatible. So if you have a lower-end PC, I recommend you stick around as some of these methods require very little power. With that being said, let's get right into it. The first method to getting high FPS renders is to record at a high FPS and then use Smart Resample to blend and blur frames in Sony Vegas. Essentially, you record at a higher frame rate than the desired amount. So for example, you record at 240 FPS instead of 60 FPS. While this doesn't do actually anything, since most videos are capped at 60 FPS when you upload to YouTube, when you render in Sony Vegas, it's a different story. Sony Vegas has a feature called Smart Resample, in which the program blends the extra frames into the video, creating a really good looking motion blur. The higher you record the frame rate at, the better the motion blur will look. Keep in mind that anything after 360 FPS doesn't look too different. Anyways, since I'm sure you're all eager to see, let me show you my OBS and Vegas settings.
Alright guys, so I'm going to show you my recording and rendering settings. I use VBR to record. CBR and CQP are also good alternatives. My target bitrate is 50,000 and my peak bitrate is 100,000. My pre-pass mode is disabled and I use a keyframe interval of 2.00. I also use H.264 to encode because I have a RX 570, but you could also use H.265 if you wanted to. In terms of video, I use 720p 120 FPS to record. If I use 1080p, the video will start lagging. Also, I use bilinear to record, and if I use the other methods, again, they'll start lagging. When we look at the render settings, my pre-render settings, I use 1080p at 60 FPS, and I also have Smart Resample enabled. I use Gaussian motion blur as well. As for the actual rendering settings, I use something called Try. I just changed it to 4K. So yeah, I render in 4K at 60 FPS. I also use variable bitrate. So I use a maximum bitrate is 40 million and an average of 20 million. You can also use constant bitrate, which I might change in the future. My encoding mode is AMD VCE. So if you have an AMD graphics card, I highly recommend use this as it'll cut down on your render times by a lot. And I use VBR to render, as I said before. Audio, so my audio settings, nothing really crazy there. In terms of system, I use the master display settings, which I don't really know what it does. I just keep it there because that's the default. And lastly, I just use project settings for my video rendering and stereoscopic 3D mode settings. And yeah, that just about does it for my video settings. On to the video.
There are numerous advantages and disadvantages to using this method. In terms of pros, the motion blur received through this method is probably the best compared to the other options. Also, you're less likely to run into rendering issues when using this method, at least when compared to other methods. While high FPS recordings may seem quite appealing right now, there's one major downside: performance. In order to get these sort of high FPS recordings, you need to ensure that you can both record at these frame rates and also consistently get them in-game. This is quite difficult for many people, including myself, as I can only record at 720p 120 FPS, or else my computer will literally blow up. That's why some of the other options in this video may be much more appealing. The next method to getting motion blur is to use a built-in motion blur that comes with your respective client. Client-side motion blur is essentially motion blur that runs on the Minecraft client rather than being recorded. This means that you can record at 60 FPS but still get really good and convincing looking motion blur. The motion blur on client essentially does what Smart Resample does in real time. It blends frames together, providing a motion blur aesthetic. The primary difference is that the motion blur is in real time, so you will notice it in your game, which may be a hindrance. The motion blur is tied to your FPS, so the higher FPS you get, the better. For the clients that have motion blur, there's a slider that changes the amount of blurring that you get. When turned up, it gives a more convincing and better looking effect, but results in you needing a very high frame rate, while turning the slider down results in less motion blur, but requiring less FPS. I've actually been using this method for quite some time now, and I think it's a great alternative. I like to combine this motion blur with method 1 to get really good looking motion blur. In order to install it, make sure you're using Badline or Lunar Client, both have motion blur. Head to the mod settings and search for motion blur. Enable the option that pops up and change the slider to what you think is right. I recommend starting at 0.4 for both clients and making your way down or up depending on what you like. I personally use 0.5 for my RX 570. The advantages to this method include being easier to run than the previous method, very useful for AMD GPUs that can't record at high FPS, while also being nearly identical to method 1. In terms of disadvantages, you cannot have fast render on when using motion blur, resulting in lower frame rates. If you turn into areas where you get lower than expected FPS, for example, I get 90 FPS in the pit, the game will look really bad and will be hard to play. And lastly, you may run into some glitches if you're using method 1 and 2 in conjunction when you're rendering in Sony Vegas. For the final method of getting motion blur, I recommend checking out Reshade. Reshade is an external program that gives you a bunch of extra coloring and style options for the selected game. Reshade also has a motion blur method, which allows you to get motion blur in Minecraft. The greatest advantage to this is that you don't need a high frame rate to run it, as it is not tied to your FPS. This means that it's the best option for lower end computers. Since the installation process is a little tricky, I'll show you how to install it. Alright guys, so now I'm going to teach you how to install Reshade. You're going to want to head over to the Reshade website and click on the download button. Next, just click on this final download button and it will install. I already have it installed, so I'll just open it up. Keep in mind that if you run the Wii U emulator CMU, put Reshade in your desktop or else it'll cause some issues. Once you're in Reshade, click the top button and it's going to show you a list of games that you can install Reshade on. Minecraft's not actually listed here, so we have to click browse and now we have to find Java W, this application right here. See, Java W is probably the hardest reason why Reshade is hard to get on Minecraft, because Java W can be located like in literally anywhere. So for example, my Java W is located in program files, x86, Minecraft launcher, runtime, grd64, bin, and Java W. I recommend you try that path as well. Like look in the runtime grd64 area. If you find it, click it. Once you find it though, click open and select OpenGL, as that's what Minecraft runs on. I already have Reshade, so let me just update it. And the only one you actually need is Legacy Standard Effects. If you want to install the other ones, you can, but I'm only going to install the Legacy. Just continue installing whatever it asks you to install. And once you get to Legacy Standard Effects, some of these will be unchecked. So just make sure you click uncheck all and then check all. That way you get everything in. And one of these is actually the motion blur one. That's why I want you to check everything. Once you're done, it should say edit Reshade settings. So just X this and X the folder. And you're going to want to head over to your Minecraft. If you've done this right, you should see a little Reshade icon pop up on the top. So yeah, this thing, you should see this pop up on the top of your Minecraft. If this is here, that means that you've installed Reshade successfully. Once you've installed Reshade, click home. And if you want to go through a tutorial, go through it. But I'm going to click skip tutorial. Now you're going to want to search for motion blur. And then check it. You can change these settings, but I recommend the default. Once you've done that, you actually get some pretty good looking motion blur. While this may seem like the best option, there are numerous disadvantages to this option as well. Reshade can only be run on default Minecraft, so you cannot use clients such as Badlion Client or Lunar Client. Forge, LaviMod, Batmod, Pixel Client, and Podcrash Plus will work since they are built into the default launcher. In addition, Reshade has arguably the worst looking motion blur out of the three. However, it does still look good, it's just not as good as the others. Lastly, you may run into major issues when using Reshade. When I was using it, I ran into many graphical issues that were not supposed to happen, so just be aware of that. In conclusion, there are many ways to get motion blur in your videos, with each of them having their advantages and disadvantages. I've created a smaller chart to show you what you should use for your given circumstance. If you have less than 60 FPS, you should consider finding a way to get more FPS. You're better off not using motion blur. If you get FPS around 60 to 90, Reshade is the best option, with 0.2 to 0.3 client-side motion blur being an okay alternative. If you get FPS around 100 to 150, try using 0.3 to 0.4 client-side motion blur, and if possible, try to record at 90 FPS. If you get 150 to 200 FPS, consider using the 0.4 client-side motion blur, with 0.5 also being viable. Try also recording at 120 FPS if possible. If you get 200 to 299 FPS, consider recording at 240 FPS, or using a 0.5 to 0.6 slider on the client motion blur. I call this a sweet spot between motion blur and FPS. If you get 300 to 399 FPS, consider recording at 240 to 360 FPS. The client option is merely an alternative at this point, since if you're getting this much FPS, you're probably going to be able to record at high FPS anyways. If you get 400 to 499 FPS, 360 FPS recording is a recommended target. If you get FPS over 500, consider donating it to people who get 15, and also record at anything from 360 to 540 FPS. If you get above 1000 FPS, you can also record it at that FPS as well. That just about does it for today's video. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, as it really motivates smaller creators such as myself to create content. If you want me to cover similar topics such as an FPS guide, PvP client reviews, or PvP guides, please let me know down in the comments. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed, and peace out.
Thank you.